Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Saving Aldric's bacon. In the 158th year of the Common Reckoning, a band of 5 elves frolicked through the forests around Bear's End, hunting and foraging and generally helping themselves to anything that they could find. The leader of the elves was Aldric. He was clad in a mail shirt, wore a sword and bore a shield. His lieutenant was Arundel, similarly equipped. The remaining 3 elves were archers, carrying hunting bows. Nindrol's torso was armoured with mail, but his companions, Takaris and Athadar, travelled light and were both unarmoured. The local farmers were not happy. They too liked to hunt and forage in the forest, and the elves were denuding it of edible fauna and flora. Furthermore, the elves had no great respect for property rights. The farmers armed themselves and muttered about what they would like to do to the elves should the opportunity arise. Aldric had a farm in the woods. He and his household tilled a couple of small fields and kept pigs, which spent their days in the forest, rootling about for acorns and other sustenance, under the supervision of Aldric's swineherd, Fritwood. Fritwood's career as a swineherd did not, as a rule, require him to arm himself, but Aldric was concerned that the elves might target his pigs. He therefore put a helmet on Fritwood's head and a long spear in his hands, and sent his son Girth to accompany him. Girth was a well-defended young man. Not only did he wear a sturdy coat of gambeson, but also a helmet, and he carried a shield. For offensive purposes he carried an axe, and also a sling. Girth had spent many hours in the forest, honing his slinging skills, of which he was particularly proud. Aldric instructed Girth and Fritwood to stay within earshot of the farm, so that he could quickly come to their assistance if required. In preparation for such circumstances, he armed himself and his remaining retainers. Aldric himself donned a gambeson coat, placed a helmet on his head, and took up his shield and war-pick. His foreman, Kennet, was similarly equipped, but in place of a war-pick he had strapped his grandfather's old sword on his hip. Borston the woodman also wore gambeson and a helmet, but he had no shield, sword or war-pick. Instead, he carried a large 2-handed felling axe. Last, and also least, was young Tidwald, with his bow and hand-axe. There was no gambeson coat for him, although Aldric did manage to find him an old helmet. Girth and Fritwood escorted their charges to a nearby clearing in the woods. The sun shone on the backs of Aldric's pigs as they nosed about in the fallen leaves. The wind whispered through the branches, and, concealed in the trees, Aldric and his band watched this rustic scene, dreaming of roast pork. Aldric first dispatched Arundel and Nindrol to work their way around to the right, to a position where they could intercept any assistance coming from the farm buildings. He then waved Takaris and Athadar forward, to a position where they could get a clear shot at their porcine prey. Athadar led the way, but his woodcraft let him down. A stick snapped under his boot. Girth turned, saw the sneaking elf, shouted the alarm and, forgetting his sling, grabbed his axe and charged into the trees. Takaris loosed an arrow at him, but it went wide. Fritwood now joined in, lumbering across the clearing, clumsily brandishing his spear, coming to Girth's assistance. And Girth needed assistance. Aldric fell upon him, slashing at him with his sword. Alerted by Girth's shouts, Aldric rushed out of the farmhouse, closely followed by Kennet and Tidwald. Borstan had some difficulty manoeuvring his enormous axe through the doorway and lagged behind. Arundel and Nindrol saw them dashing across the fields. Nindrol's bow sang, and an arrow skewered Aldric's calf. But Aldric was made of tough stuff. He kept on running. Back in the woods, things were getting lively. Fritwood jabbed his spear frantically at Athadar, who evaded the attack, withdrawing back into the trees. Torcaris now changed targets and took a shot at Fritwood. Once again his arrow went wide, but only just. Fritwood flinched and recoiled a couple of steps. And now Athadar reached for his quiver. Seeing this, Fritwood charged back toward him, trying to run him through before he could get his shot off. In the meantime, Orodrin had been belabouring Girth with sword strokes, but Girth's shield proved to be stout, and his defences were not breached. He took a couple of steps back, hefting his axe, looking for an opportunity to close with Orodrin and land a telling blow. Being shot had alerted Aldric to the presence of Arundel and Nindrol. He changed his direction of travel, leading Kennet and Borstan toward the advancing pair of elves. Meanwhile Tidwald lurked in the background, arrow nocked. After all, he had no gambeson to protect him from elven swords, and he therefore hoped to take the elves down from a safe distance. Aldric vaulted the wall of his field, but he landed on the leg that had an arrow stuck through it. He winced and stumbled, and then Arundel was upon him. The elf's sword flashed in the sunlight as he cut at the farmer. But even with his injured leg, Aldric was agile. He twisted to the side, avoiding Arundel's descending blade, and then lurched forward, keeping low, swinging his warpick at Arundel's legs. Arundel leapt backward, trying to get out of harm's way. Trying, but not succeeding. For now, burly Borstan came to Aldric's assistance, swinging his great two-handed axe at Arundel's head. Arundel dodged the blow, but was again pushed backward. Meanwhile, Nindrol had been amusing himself by loosing arrows at Kennet, one of which had lodged in Kennet's shield. Kennet did not much enjoy being used for target practice. He decided that if he was in closer proximity to Arundel, Nindrol would be less inclined to shoot at him. He too vaulted the field wall and took a swing at Arundel. This was the third attack on Arundel in quick succession, and for him it was third time unlucky. He was not able to evade Kennet's blade, which bit deep into his sword arm. Kennet struck at Arundel again, a strike which Arundel defended with his shield. But even as he did so, Borstan stepped forward and once again swung his mighty axe. Arundel put up his sword to try and block the blow, but his injured sword arm was not up to the task. The sword was dashed from his hand, the descending axe found its mark, and that was the end of Arundel. Nindrol was knocking another arrow on his bowstring. He looked at Aldric, Borstan and Kennet, who were standing over Arundel's corpse. They looked back at him and slowly advanced toward him. He smiled nervously and slowly took a step back. Tidwald saw his opportunity and let fly an arrow which hissed past Nindrol's left ear. Nindrol took another slow step back. Too slow. Nindrol might have thought that shooting an arrow through Aldric's leg would slow him down. He was wrong. Aldric sprang forward, and before Nindrol could turn and run, he was spitted on Aldric's warpick. So, by the farm, things were going well for the Bears Enders, but not so among the trees. As Frithwood charged toward him, Athadar dropped his bow and drew his sword. Frithwood lunged at Athadar with his spear. Athadar nimbly sidestepped Frithwood's thrust and then stabbed his sword blade into Frithwood's face with fatal effect. The death of Frithwood caused Girth to rethink his strategy. Remembering that he was carrying a sling, he decided to put some distance between himself and the elves in the trees and see if he could find an opportunity to use it. He fell back into the clearing where he stood, surrounded by pigs, sling in hand, considering whether Orodrin or Athadar presented the better target. But he never reached a decision. Orodrin ran at him, brandishing his sword, and Girth once more reached for his axe. Orodrin swung his sword in a wide arc toward Girth's head. Girth took the blow on his shield and countered with a ferocious blow of his own, splitting Orodrin's shield in two. Even as Orodrin staggered under the force of that stroke, Girth unleashed another, even heavier. The axe head tore through Orodrin's mail and embedded itself in his torso. Thus died Orodrin, his lifeblood soaking into the leaf litter, his carcass snouted by Aldric's pigs. Girth had put paid to Orodrin, but he was still outnumbered 2-1. Athadar and Torcaris lurked in the trees, working their bowstrings. Girth could have waited for Aldric and the others to come and lend him a hand, but he was concerned that if he did so, he would look like a pincushion by the time they arrived. And in any case, his blood was up. He charged back into the trees, brandishing his axe, looking to detach Torcaris' head from his shoulders. Torcaris met him with a drawn sword, a sword which Torcaris used skillfully. Although he was not able to land a telling blow on Girth, he did succeed in keeping him at a distance. And now Athadar joined the fight, and Girth had to defend himself against two adversaries. For a moment things looked bad for Girth, but help was coming, at first in the shape of Borstan, who came running up, felling axe at the ready, with Kennet, Aldric and Tidwald not far behind. At this point Athadar decided that enough was enough. He turned and fled. Torcaris did not run. His eyes shone with the joy of battle, and once again his sword blade flickered, feinting and cutting and thrusting at Girth, first high and then low, trying to find a way past Girth's defences. But Girth stood firm, blocking with his shield and then parrying with the haft of his axe, knocking Torcaris' sword aside and then stepping forward and striking down, splitting Torcaris' skull in two. So ended the fight, and thus it was that Girth saved Aldric's bacon.